would visit Delos, and then a number of islands in the Dodecanese, returning to the mainland by way of Crete, with expeditions to Epidaurus, Mycenae, and Delphi. The passengers would be mainly British and American, but there was a small party of French also, and a sprinkling of Germans and Italians. There were to be Greek guides on board and several lecturers of European reputation, including a distinguished Byzantine scholar, the Bishop of Solway, and that famous Hellenophile and popularizer of classical Greek literature, Jeremy Street. Nigel had no hesitation in booking passages. The itinerary of the Menelaus, taking in so many islands whose very name had the ring of legend, sounded altogether admirable. Claire's dark eyes lit up when he told her where they would be going. Nigel felt no premonition that this itinerary would carry him into a labyrinth of human motives darker and more complex than the dwelling of the Minotaur. Chapter 1. Embarkation. 16 weeks later, Nigel was leaning on the rail of the promenade deck, looking at the shipping in the Piraeus. This morning he and Claire had paid a last visit to the theatre of Dionysus and the Acropolis. The heat, it was nearly 100 degrees in the shade, and the perfect majesty of the Parthenon had silenced them. Even Claire's inordinate appetite for sightseeing was temporarily sated. So, after a leisurely lunch, they took a taxi to the Piraeus with the view of settling in before the mass of passengers arrived. The Menelaus had been lying at the quayside for 36 hours, and the cabins were suffocatingly hot. Opening the porthole of Claire's, which adjoined his own on the main deck, was enough to bring Nigel out in a profuse sweat. Claire announced that she was going to have a strip wash and then get everything shipshape, a procedure which would involve, Nigel had no doubt, unpacking and strewing her clothes all over her own bunk and that of her fellow occupant, a Miss E. Jameson, B.A., who had fortunately not yet turned up. Nigel left her to it, fought his way through a blast of heat to open the porthole of his own cabin, which, the passenger list told him, he would be sharing with Dr. Stephen Plunkett, M.D., M.Sc., neatly disposed his belongings, and came out on deck, gasping for air. Having filled in time investigating the main features of the vessel, the two saloons, forward and aft, the bars, not open yet, the small swimming pool, still dry, on the forecastle beneath the bridge, Nigel took up his position at the port rail of the promenade deck amidships. Beneath him, a flat tanker was oiling the Menelaus through an umbilical cord of pipeline. Beyond, the blue and white flags of the 3 Greek corvettes, moored together, rippled in a light breeze that had risen. There were 3 passenger vessels, their white paint dazzling in the Athenian sunlight, lying stem to stern at the quays opposite. One of these, the TSS Adriatici, was the ship chartered by Swans on which Nigel had unsuccessfully tried to get berths for Claire and himself. A large P&O cruise liner with a single funnel like a huge yellow pepper pot was getting up steam. Some weather-beaten tramp steamers, a gaggle of assorted small craft, warehouses, ship cranes, and the hazy blue-white sky made up the rest of the scene. In the air hung a pervasive smell. Fumes from the tanker mingled with an odour of, was it Greek cooking or decaying vegetables, or both? It might be convenient, thought Nigel, that he was sharing a cabin with the ship's doctor. Nigel tried to imagine this place in the 5th century, with the triremes coming in and the long walls running up to Athens, but the heat had taken all the spring out of his imagination. A sudden outburst of sound from the other side of the Menelaus broke into his thoughts. Moving over to the starboard side and looking down on the quay to which the ship was moored, Nigel saw a lorry laden with rectangular chunks of ice. A sailor, standing on a makeshift cradle hung from the deck, was passing these into the ship through a porthole one by one as they were handed up to him. A violent altercation had blown up between the overseer of the shore party handling the ice and a ship's officer who was leaning over the rail 20 feet away from Nigel. Whether the ice had arrived late, or was the wrong shape, or whether the two disputants just disliked each other's faces, Nigel had no means of determining. But the scene could not have been more dramatic if it had been leading up to the crisis of an ancestral blood feud. At one point,